Tonight on Nova, the Dead Sea Scrolls. What secrets do these ancient texts hold? Will they dramatically change religious history for Jews, for Christians? Controversy has shrouded these documents right down to the present day.
That's the fascinating thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can never know what will turn out next.
Will we ever unlock the secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
In the fall of 1946, 3 Bedouin shepherds were moving their herd through the Judean desert along the shore of the Dead Sea. One day, when rounding up a stray, the youngest happened upon some caves near a place called Qumran. He decided to explore, hoping to find buried treasure. One cave was narrow and deep, so he threw a stone and was startled by the sound of pottery breaking. There was no gold inside. But on that day, a shepherd boy had stumbled upon the greatest archaeological discovery of the century, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, the fact is that Israel is the most excavated country in the world. And in spite of that fact, in spite of the fact that this country has been excavated now by scholars for over 120 years, we have very little written material. But here we have a library. We have 800 manuscripts. Here you have a human voice, and a human voice which is easily recognizable.
This was a spectacular find. Religious manuscripts preserved for 2,000 years. Dating from around 250 BC to 70 AD, the scrolls were written mainly in Hebrew and Aramaic on panels of leather or papyrus. Among the scrolls were the oldest biblical texts ever found.
But again, look at the letters, and if you know a little Hebrew, if you have been to a Hebrew school, you can see and you can read. Each and every letter, you can read the same letters.
At the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, several original scrolls are on display. In the center is the longest, the Book of Isaiah. It is 1,000 years older than any other copy we have, and surprisingly readable to the contemporary public. In addition to the biblical texts, the scrolls included a number of strange religious manuscripts never seen before. Scholars are still debating who wrote them and what they reveal about the origins of Christianity and the Judaism we know today. Ever since their discovery, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been embroiled in controversy and political intrigue. This is a saga that is still unfolding. The tribe of Bedouins who discovered the scrolls had roamed the western shore of the Dead Sea for centuries. In 1946, this territory was part of British Palestine. The Bedouins often smuggled goods across the desert to Bethlehem to sell on the black market. But the 7 scrolls discovered by the shepherd boy were not the usual contraband, and for some weeks they were left in a bag hanging on a tent pole. Finally, the scrolls were taken to Bethlehem to sell. It was risky, because excavating antiquities without a license was illegal. The Bedouin heard about an Arab dealer, Kondo, who had a shop on the main street.
Well, the story goes that the first Bedouin that found the scrolls came to Kondo. He understood that the scrolls are made of leather, and he believed that this old leather could be used for straps for his sandals. So Kondo, being a cobbler, was the man to consult with. And he was a part-time antiquities dealer, besides being a cobbler. And he understood immediately that this might bring some money.
Kondo took 4 of the scrolls to the head of his church, St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem. Suspecting that the scrolls were written in ancient Syriac, the Archbishop Samuel bought them for $100. But because of the political situation, it was difficult to find scholars to authenticate the manuscripts. These were the last days of British rule in Palestine. Violent confrontations between Jews, Arabs, and British soldiers were frequent. At this time, E.L. Sukenik, an archaeologist in Jerusalem, learned that the other 3 scrolls were for sale in Bethlehem.
Today I met the antiquities dealer. A Hebrew book has been discovered in a jar. He showed me a fragment written on parchment. The script seems very ancient to me. Is it possible?
It was dangerous for the Jewish archaeologists to travel to Arab Bethlehem, but Sukenik decided to go anyway. He bought the 3 scrolls and returned to Jerusalem just in time. The United Nations voted for partition, and the city exploded in violence.
Well, there was some amazing coincidence by the fact that the scrolls were identified as such on the same night that the United Nations decided upon the creation of the State of Israel. That was November 29, 1947. So the meeting of those events is very, very meaningful.
The State of Israel was born. 3 of the 7 Dead Sea Scrolls were secured by Sukenik in time for this momentous occasion. But while there was celebration in the streets, the other 4 scrolls were about to embark on a strange journey. Having confirmed their authenticity, Archbishop Samuel took the 4 scrolls in his possession to America to sell.
At a ceremony in the Library of Congress in Washington, His Grace Mar Samuel, Metropolitan of Jerusalem, unrolls a scroll said to be the oldest known Bible manuscript in the world. A 24-foot document that is virtually the complete book of the prophet Isaiah.
The scrolls caused a sensation. But even after an extensive publicity tour, the Archbishop couldn't find a buyer willing to pay his price, $1 million. Samuel tried to sell the scrolls for 5 years. Finally, he placed an ad in, of all places, the Wall Street Journal. By sheer coincidence, Yigael Yadin, son of the Jewish archaeologist Sukenik, was in America at the time.
I read the ad again and again, but could not believe my eyes. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale. I inquired through an agent and a bank, and they started a long negotiation. Without Archbishop Samuel knowing who he was negotiating with, we finally agreed that the 4 scrolls would be bought for $250,000. My only regret is that my father did not live to see the scrolls come home to Israel.
Now at last, all 7 scrolls were together, and the shrine of the book was built to house them. One chapter in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls had come to a close. Jerusalem in the summer of 1990. The news was of strikes, occupied territories, a new conservative government, and the Intifada, the Arab uprising. It was to this city of ancient conflicts that scholars came from all over the world to participate in another drama involving age-old disputes. At the annual Congress on Biblical Archaeology, the session on the Dead Sea Scrolls was a big draw.
Sections of the scroll.
Scholars believe the scrolls may help us understand how Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism emerged out of a tumultuous era.
Which the author-redactor composed himself.
Now, 40 years after their discovery, the scrolls are still the subject of intense interest.
The whole world of Qumran scholars, and there are hundreds of them, are trying to figure out who these people were that created the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're struggling with this. A professor in Kansas has assembled on his computer 10,000 articles that have been written on the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 400 articles, scholarly articles, in Polish on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mention these simply to give you an example of the concern and interest around the world in scholarship that there is in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
On the other side of the city, in East Jerusalem, is a Center for Dead Sea Scrolls Research, the École Biblique, the French School of Biblical Archaeology. For a part of the year, it has been the home of a scholar who has devoted his entire career to the study of the scrolls. John Strugnell, a professor at the Harvard Divinity School, was working in his small room listening to his favorite piece of music, Carmina Burana.
I came in August 1954. I remember when I came here, my teacher told me, let's go out there, it's good to get a feel for the country. Maybe you'll stay there 1 year, maybe 2. And 40 years later, here I am. I've lived in this room, I think, for half a year for each of 8 years. It has 1 bed and all the archives of the Qumran project in those boxes.
Later to become a controversial figure, Strugnell was chosen editor-in-chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1987 because of his long history with the material. John Strugnell started studying the scrolls almost 40 years ago. As a young scholar, he was invited to Israel as another chapter in this story unfolded. For several years after the discovery, it was thought there were no more scrolls in the Judean desert. But the Bedouins continued to comb the cliffs, and in 1952 they found a second cave containing manuscripts. This galvanized a team of British and French archaeologists to search 275 caves, hoping to uncover other scrolls first, so they wouldn't have to buy them from the Bedouins. In Cave 3, they found a single scroll made of copper, and then abandoned the effort. Within months, the Bedouins hit upon a gold mine, Cave 4. Though archaeologists and Bedouins would find 7 more caves with scroll material, this was the mother lode. John Strugnell was there soon after the discovery.
And in Cave 4, we had fragments of some 700, maybe 800 manuscripts. They're all tiny fragments. We had 800 manuscripts, probably 100 fragments of each. That makes what? 80,000. That's what we had.
The fragments came in slowly, a few pieces at a time. wrapped in toilet paper, cigarette cases, or even shoe boxes. Though the Bedouins had excavated Cave 4 illegally, the Jordanians agreed to purchase the fragments at an official price, $2.80 per square centimeter of inscribed surface. The idea was to keep the material off the black market and in one place, the Palestine Archaeological Museum.
That material was bought over a period of months, indeed over a period of years, from the Bedouin. I had the good fortune of being given all the excavated materials in the summer of 1953 to examine, which I did.
Frank Cross and John Strugnell were part of a small team put together by the Palestine Museum. The museum was under Jordanian control, so no Jewish scholars were included, and this would become an issue in the years to come. All of those on the team were paleographers, experts in the history of writing. The first scrolls discovered in 1946 had been well preserved in earthenware jars. This was not the case with the contents of Cave 4.
There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of fragments, which were about a meter under the soil of a cave, and had been destroyed not only by worms and predators in antiquity, but also by soil moisture, soil acids, and so on.
Some were, you could read them straight away. Some were pitch black. They were all very dry, and in order to read them and unfold them, we had to put them in cigar humidor, and we put them on a little cotton wool on a saucer inside the humidor, and we sort of took them out every half hour to see if they were ready to be unfolded.
The fragments, as they came from Cave 4, were a mixed jumble. They were like this, so that we arranged over long, long tables in the scrollery hundreds and hundreds of glass plates under which we put fragments. And then we slowly began to assemble fragments that belonged together by script, by the look of the leather, and eventually by the content.
Say we're confronted with 2,000 fragments of varying sizes. We look at the big ones first, and we see, are they a Bible? If they're Bible, we put them into one side. We say, this is the book of Genesis, or Isaiah. But that only takes care of about 15% of the fragments. Then the main work starts, which is handwriting. We study the handwriting carefully, and then we go through all the other fragments and see what is written by the same scribe.
After many years, you get to know your scribes. You know them firsthand. You know what manuscripts they wrote. And we'd find a tiny fragment of the letter 2, and we'd shout, here's scribe so-and-so. And off to that plate the fragment would go. So script became increasingly important as the delicacy of our work persisted.
The work of deciphering the fragments found in the early 50s still takes place here at the old Palestine Museum, now called the Rockefeller Museum.
Was it possible that that was put on a Pentateuchal Paraphrases?
No, it's a separate
manuscript.
Stored under lock and key and accessible only to the select team of scholars are the original remains of almost 600 manuscripts. Strugnell agreed to take out some of the precious material.
Why I show you this fragment, it's a nice big fragment. We have hardly any fragments as big as this. It comes from Cave 11, it's a scroll of the Psalms. It's a nice late manuscript, and we have much more of it going right down to the end of the room. This is about the second half of a manuscript of the Book of Numbers. The Book of Numbers is part of the Pentateuch at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. Here you have the second half of the book. There are about another 6 or so plates. It took us a long time to reconstruct because its text isn't quite the text that we find in the Hebrew Bible. And this is roughly where the fragment stood in the original roll.
Here we are.
Now that's something really important. You can hardly read it because the ink has very often gone, and all you get is the holes that the ink reads. But this is the oldest biblical manuscript in the world. It's the book of Exodus. Professor Cross dates it about 250 BC. It's beautiful in the eye of a paleographer and very important for the study of the biblical text.
Emil Puesch is a member of the elite scroll team and is working on one of the previously unknown manuscripts. This document is a photocopy of what is called the Thanksgiving Scroll, which consists of a group of hymns praising the Lord. The scroll scholar has to have the instincts of a detective. While working with some unidentified fragments, Puesch was able to make some new connections and construct a whole new part of a manuscript.
And when I look on this, very quickly, I saw that the join is not possible. He said that it's joining here, one fragment. I think no, the join is not good, and the lines are not on the same. I remark that this fragment here join perfectly on this one here. Now, where to put this one? The same color or not? And in looking for this, I had to work with more pieces, and this pieces here is fitting in this place. I try to find more fragments fitting. This small one, 44, is joining here, in this place. And the results are in this way. The first one, and this one. And this is fitting with the next column. And now I have lines, not complete, but it means here an introduction of a part of this scroll, and after that the beginning of one hymn. To do this work, you need concentration, of course, but to put everything of this scroll in your mind, in your memory, and to come back many times, days and nights. And many problems are resolved during the night, when your conscience is unconscious.
Emil Puesch inherited his place on the scroll team when his mentor, Father J. Starkey, died in 1988. Starkey bequeathed much of his still unpublished work to the younger man. While this passing on of material has maintained continuity in the work, it also has affected how the scrolls have been interpreted since their discovery. For as long as scholars have been piecing together the scrolls, they have wondered who wrote them. When the manuscripts were found in the caves, archaeologists began to reevaluate some nearby unexcavated ruins, which had been dismissed as a Roman fortress. The Arabs called it Qumran. Perhaps this was where the scrolls were written, 40 miles east of Jerusalem. Even in the 2nd century BC, Jerusalem was a thriving metropolis, the capital of Judea. Centuries of occupation by the Greeks and then the Syrians were brought to an end by a Jewish revolt. For the first time in several hundred years, an independent Jewish state existed. According to ancient historians, this was a turbulent time in Jewish history, when several groups vied for control of the temple and religious authority. One group, the Essenes, was an extremely pious sect of Jews, some of whom went to the desert to escape what they believed was spiritual corruption in Jerusalem. Here, a community of mostly men lived a life of strict discipline.
Whoever has deliberately lied shall do penance for 6 months. Whoever has deliberately insulted his companion unjustly shall do penance for 1 year and shall be excluded. If he has failed...
A number of the scrolls never seen before contained radical religious doctrine, which sounded very much like they were written by the Essenes.
According to all these rules, they shall separate from the habitation of ungodly men, and shall go into the wilderness and prepare the way of him.
One scroll, called the Manual of Discipline, outlines the strict rules of a religious fraternity. Its authors were preparing for the imminent coming of the Messiah.
They took it very seriously. Taking it seriously meant they went to the desert to prepare themselves for the great event. And preparing themselves for the great event meant to live under very difficult conditions. No family life, very harsh climatic conditions.
Here in the ruins at Qumran, archaeologists would find evidence to support the theory that the Essenes lived here and were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
We are right now in Qumran. In this place, archaeological excavations were carried out in 1954. We found a general dining hall for the people to eat, and we found a place with the storage of many pieces of clay.
The excavation of Qumran began in the early 50s, when the Arab-Israeli conflict had stabilized enough to allow an exploration of the site. In charge was archaeologist Father Roland Deveau from the École Biblique in Jerusalem. Working with a team of Bedouins, Deveau spent 5 years digging the site, uncovering what he believed was convincing evidence that this was where the Dead Sea Scrolls were written.
All sorts of tales are told about him, whether he was an aristocrat or he'd run away from the Opera Comique in Paris, how he one day had a hyena shot and then cooked a hyena stew and served it at Qumran to his fellow excavators. Deveau was quite an experience. When Deveau started excavating here, because obviously it had some relationship to the caves, he was struck by the fact that the buildings were all communal, no private rooms. And as he cleared more and more of it, he was struck by this fact and followed, in a sense, the analogy of monastic buildings.
Deveau excavated a small room with hundreds of pots, which he thought was the pantry of the community. Close to that was an unusually large room, which might have been a dining hall. In one of the scrolls, there is even a description of a communal meal, where the members sit down in ritual order according to seniority.
So there, once again, the evidence of the scrolls and the evidence of the archaeology fitted round this monastic institution. And you must remember that the ancient authors about the Essenes sometimes even used the word monastery in describing them.
Deveau was struck by other parallels between the site and the scrolls. The elaborate system of aqueducts and cisterns could have provided water for the ritual baths described in the scrolls, as well as for daily life. The cemetery of more than 1,000 graves contained mostly the remains of men. And finally, Deveau excavated a room where he thought the scrolls were written. There he found several inkwells and the remains of plaster tables and benches. These he reconstructed as desks where the scribes wrote their manuscripts. 40 years later, Deveu's interpretation of Qumran and the theory that the Essenes wrote the scrolls are the official explanation presented to the public.
This site was once inhabited by the Essenes. The Essene, called in Hebrew Esseim, were those people that decided to apart themselves from civilization up on the mountains from Jerusalem and to come to live in here, waiting for the coming of the Messiah.
Also according to the theory, the Essene community was destroyed in 68 AD by the Romans, but not before its members had hidden their precious manuscripts in nearby caves. Lawrence Schiffman from New York University is one of many scholars questioning whether the Essenes wrote the scrolls. He believes a re-examination is crucial.
The centrality of the Dead Sea Scrolls is based primarily on their use as a source for answering what is one of the fundamental questions in Western civilization. Namely, how do we get from the religious traditions of the Hebrew Bible to what we have a few centuries later, on the one hand in Talmudic Judaism and on the other hand in early Christianity?
As we can understand from this scroll, they regard themselves as the Essene. I mean, there's not that many possibilities.
You use the word Essenes. Now, do you mean the Essenes of 150 BC, 50 BC, 50 AD? These were movements.
Those three ancient main movements.
At a seminar at the Hebrew University, members of the scroll team, as well as other scholars, discussed the origins of the scrolls.
It seems to me we've oversimplified the problem, that to a great extent what we're talking about here is some group of people that, for a variety of reasons, became radicalized.
Today, the debate over who wrote the scrolls is being fueled by new evidence and divergent points of view.
It may be a much more complex question than just, are these the Essenes?
The scrolls were found out of the blue. We had before nothing.
Devorah Demont, an Israeli, was made a scroll editor in 1985. Today, the participation of a new generation of Jewish scholars is affecting the interpretation of the scrolls.
New Testament. In our small seminar, weekly seminar, you really have the possibility to see science in the making, to see how people think, to see, to get to know people and to realize that theories are also persons.
The men who excavated Qumran and led Dead Sea Scroll research in the early days were all Christian scholars. DeVoe was a Dominican monk and in charge of both the site and the scroll team working in East Jerusalem. Not only did they see the origins of monasticism at Qumran, but they also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls the roots of Christianity.
We have to remember that scholars have seen the Essenes as a kind of proto-Christianity, finding in Essene-Dead Sea Scroll life something of the pattern which could be observed in the early church according to the New Testament.
The picture of dualism, that God and predestination, forces of light, forces of darkness, that's really shared between the early church and the people at Qumran. There are a lot of smaller details, but if you want a big scheme, that's the one that I'd choose.
And the sons of light shall battle with the sons of darkness, amid the shouts of a mighty multitude and the clamor of gods and men, to make manifest the might of God.
Among the unknown scrolls was another extraordinary manuscript which has been called the War Scroll. The authors identify themselves as the sons of light, preparing for a holy war with their enemies, the sons of darkness. At the end of this war, the Messiah will appear and deliver them to a new Israel.
The projection on the heavens of the moral warfare between good and evil, that kind of dualistic mythology, which was part of the Essene picture of the world, did come into Christianity in no small part.
The tendency to see Christian origins in the Dead Sea Scrolls dominated scholarship for a number of years, but eventually it became clear that the scrolls could be seen from a different perspective. They not only illuminate the origins of Christianity, but they also reveal a great deal about ancient Judaism during a pivotal time.
When the scrolls were first discovered and being analyzed, it was assumed that they would only be able to teach about the particular sect which wrote some of the documents, composed some of the documents, and which left the materials in the scrolls. Now, as we study more and more of the corpus as a whole, including many of the texts that haven't yet been published, it's clear that what we have here is a collection of materials which give us information about many Jewish groups which existed in the Second Temple period.
This is a crucial moment in the Jewish history because after the destruction of the temple, all Judaism was codified and fixed into the form we now know and currently called Rabbinic Judaism. This means that the scrolls reflect the variety, the openness that existed before this date.
The study of the scrolls has always been linked to the realities of who has possession of them and and how that work is funded. In the years following the discovery of Cave 4, the team of scholars was able to work full-time at the museum because they were supported by John D. Rockefeller, Jr.
In 1954, Mr. Rockefeller funded all the research on Qumran. He gave money for 6 years. He thought that was enough. If he'd lived, he'd certainly have given us more.
Rockefeller died in 1960 without leaving more money to support the work on the scrolls. Unable to stay in Jerusalem, the 8 members of the team divided up the hundreds of still unpublished manuscripts and returned to academic life. Then, in 1967, the saga of the Dead Sea Scrolls took an unexpected twist. For 6 days, Israel battled Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. One of the sites of intense fighting was the strategically located hill in East Jerusalem, where the Palestine Museum and all of the original scroll fragments were located. Israeli troops entered the museum and took control. By the end of the war, Israel had acquired several new territories, among them East Jerusalem. The museum was now in Israeli hands, but the scrolls were a different matter. DeVoe insisted that the original team had jurisdiction over the scrolls under international law, and the Israelis accepted the status quo for nearly 2 decades. But the team's tight control over the scrolls and the exclusion of Jewish scholars was a monopoly that couldn't last. Devorah Demont is one of several Israelis recently assigned manuscripts because of pressure from the academic community and because the work required the expertise of Judaic scholars.
There is a whole series of problems related to working on the manuscripts themselves, which is really special, and you can't learn it from reading scholarly discussions. You have to work on these things in order to appreciate it. I feel like I have moved into another level, another world. And I was really surprised to discover the extent to which people who don't work on real manuscripts are outsiders. Maybe this is why they are frustrated.
Though more scholars had become involved, the manuscripts in the Rockefeller Museum were still controlled by a select group. Many scholars who had been denied access found the situation intolerable, and their grievances became national news.
It's been 42 years since the discovery of the first of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls in what is now the Israeli-occupied West Bank. The ancient manuscripts are expected to tell great stories about life in Judea at the time of Jesus Christ. But most of those stories remain untold, and thereby hangs tonight's tale.
They behave like children who have the cookie jar all to themselves. And for no reason. There are enough cookies to go all around.
Many other projects are going along at the same pace, and no one ever worries about them. We seem to have acquired a bunch of fleas who are in the business of annoying us.
The fleas that Strugnell refers to are among the most prominent scholars in scroll research. They have been frustrated by the lack of access and by the fact that only 20% of the Cave 4 fragments have been published. For almost a decade, the Biblical Archaeology Review has taken up their cause.
We at Biblical Archaeology Review are concerned with the academic process of making scholarship available. So there's a principle here that's very important. And that principle would apply whether these were Dead Sea Scrolls or Manichaean papyri. The principle of monopoly is wrong. But it becomes particularly egregious when it's abused, as they have done, So that we're now over 35 years since these assignments were made, and we still don't have access to significant portions of the material.
The material we're talking about is material which has, over decades, been carefully put together by the scholars who are editing the material. It is no longer the way it was once. It is now a construct, a scholarly creation, if you wish. And therefore, scholars are somewhat jealous to give away a lifetime's research.
They want the interpretive rights all to themselves, not simply the rights to translate it and make it available to the public, but the right to tell people for the first time, even if it takes 25 years or 3 generations, what it means.
The scholarly controversy over the Dead Sea Scrolls continued to attract the attention of the media, and these stories have had their effect.
בנושא הזה עוסקים במסגרת הקונגרס 3 פעמים.
The Israeli Antiquity Authority, which had been in charge of the scrolls since the '67 war, responded to the public outcry by establishing a committee to oversee the publication process. At a press conference in Jerusalem, the committee outlined its plans to the public for the first time.
What we are trying to do now is to revise or devise a structure which will help us, all of us, in stepping up the pace of publication. And this, in fact, has already occurred or happened.
A timetable was negotiated with the scroll team, and the editors also agreed to divest themselves of some of their material by assigning manuscripts to other qualified scholars.
Of the original group of scholars, only 3 are left. And in the process of transferring material to their successors or to their students, time was lost, without any doubt. But still, one thing is obvious, that at the beginning, too much material was assigned to too few scholars.
What we're looking for is right over in here.
That's the Lamed, isn't it?
That's
The first generation of scroll editors has made a practice of assigning some of their unpublished material to graduate students.
It's very faint, as you can see, very dark. Cross thinks that you've got a fleck of ink missing.
Many of the established scholars outside this inner circle are critical that younger scholars are being given the very access which they are being denied.
That's a genuine criticism. I mean, it's also jealousy and things like that, but there's a certain measure of truth. What I'm proud of is this, that I have trained a generation of students. If I have a heart attack tonight, I have 15 students that can come and finish my manuscripts.
I'd like to see what you think.
I and Cross, and now Milik and Puesh as well, we're as much in the business of forming the next generation as in the business of taking care of our own work.
And the rest of it goes smoothly.
Father Roland DeVoe died without ever training anyone to carry on his work at Qumran. Though he spent 5 years working at the site, he never published his excavation. His legacy, including his field notes and photographs, is now being re-examined with startling consequences.
Je suppose que c'est le mur nord.
Et ça ne faut pas être ceci, regarde là.
Non, parce que ça, c'est la porte.
Pauline and Robert Donseil are Belgian archaeologists. The École Biblique hired them to revisit Qumran and review DeVoe's work with the idea of publishing his excavation.
Après, tu as 46, 5, donc c'est 27 ici.
3 years later, they are challenging DeVoe's interpretation.
We're trying not to think about the scrolls, to forget about them, to forget about what was found in the caves nearby, and just look at the settlement. At the settlement and what was found in each room and what type of material there was. And through the study of the objects, we find very different things.
According to the Donseils, the plaster tables which DeVoe identified as desks for the scribes could have been dining room tables. The ceramic jars found on the site can be linked to a perfume and cosmetic industry, which prevailed along the Dead Sea 2,000 years ago. And the hundreds of glass fragments indicate that the inhabitants of Qumran may have had quite a luxurious lifestyle.
Comme ceci. Donc on est passé à travers la grande citerne ronde.
By studying the site as well, the Donceals have begun to question many of Devoe's observations which connected Qumran to the monastic Essene. With water so scarce in this climate, the Donceals doubt Devoe's theory that the cisterns would have been used for the ritual baths described in the scrolls. And the large room which Devoe called a communal dining room looks to the Donceals like an assembly hall found in palatial villas. This re-examination of the evidence is leading the Donceals to imagine a different picture of life at Qumran.
It was a quite luxurious dwelling, with the big rooms, with the water, everything there. There's everything to go with a winter villa, as they still have them today for residents of Jerusalem coming down to Jericho along the Dead Sea and the Jordan in the cold winter months.
New evidence concerning the origins of the scrolls is emerging not only from the site, but even more dramatically from one manuscript. Among the material found in Cave 4 were several copies of a letter. Strugnell has been studying these fragments for more than 35 years, but only recently realized their significance.
Here you have what I now know fragments of 5 out of the 6 manuscripts of a very important work which we call MMT, Miksat Maaseh Torah, which we think was a letter written by the head of the Qumran sect to the head of his opponents in about 160 BC. None of these manuscripts contains the whole work, but with careful argument, you can piece together most of the work. We think it was to a man who's addressed as you and your people Israel. So a king, a high priest, high political. From, we don't quite know, it was obviously from an opponent of this person. Whether it was from the Qumran sect as a group, an ancestor of the Qumran sect, or the head of the Qumran sect, we can't be quite sure.
What is clear is that this document will dramatically change our understanding of who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
This text is essentially a foundation document of the sect, in which those who founded it write a letter to the leaders of the Jerusalem establishment, telling them about 22 matters of Jewish law upon which they disagree, and because of which they have formed the sect.
Who were the people who took refuge in this hard life in the desert? Now in this letter called MMT, they seem to be telling us both who they were and why they left Jerusalem. Perhaps they were not Essenes, but a sect of priests called the Sadducees, one of the 2 major Jewish groups vying for power. If this is true, then the authors of the scrolls were not originally a fringe group, but came from the mainstream of Jewish life.
When I first heard about the existence of this document, I found it absolutely unbelievable that it had not been known previously, considering its extremely great importance for the history of the sect. And as far as I can see, had this document been published earlier, the whole history of the field would have been different, and the reigning Essene hypothesis might never have even come into existence.
I'd like to ask Professor Strugnell a question about MMT, which has been mentioned frequently today. I think it's a general view that this is an extremely important document, which really has fired up considerable new interest in the Qumran materials. It was first announced, I believe, sometime in the first half of the 1980s.
And what happens? Well, he brings someone that knows Hebrew language very well into the project, and they work on it, and they write a commentary and notes. I'm told it's 500 pages long. It's 6 years later, and we still can't see it.
Yes, because it's not finished. There's a question about the order of columns, major questions. It's a damaged document. 6 manuscripts, each one badly torn up. We have to piece it together, and then finally, after you piece it together and you start writing a commentary, you suddenly say, my, that changes this. And that's the way it was. In other words, it's revolutionary in its impact, but to find out what that impact is a slow process.
The poster in Strugnell's office seems to characterize his attitude on the subject. It reads, "I may have my faults, but being wrong isn't one of them." Strugnell predicts MMT will be published by 1992. The significance of this document and other manuscripts that are now being prepared will be debated for years to come. The question remains, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? The evidence is not conclusive, but the scrolls do offer new insights. We now know that ideas later identified with Christianity existed much earlier within a Judaism which was far richer and more varied than scholars had ever realized. Were the scrolls written here? Was Qumran a monastery? The Sadducees were wealthy priests. Perhaps that explains the evidence for a luxurious dwelling. Or was this, as one scholar proposes, simply a Roman fortress with no connection to the scrolls?
I think that many of the questions that have to do with the scrolls may never be answered. That is to say, I think we have to recognize that in scholarship there are certain kinds of issues which cannot be clarified by the evidence that's available, and various theories will always exist. On the other hand, there are a lot of questions that are bound to be clarified by the publication of the additional materials.
So we can wait for surprises also. And that's the fascinating thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can never know what will turn out next.
What happened next surprised everyone. In November 1990, John Strugnell gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper and was quoted as saying that Judaism was a horrible religion that should have disappeared.
My initial reaction was that he had been misquoted because I've known him for a very long time and had never heard any such views.
A month later, the story was picked up by the American press. At about the same time, Strugnell was hospitalized with a manic depressive condition compounded by a drinking problem.
I think some of his colleagues and students would like to think that he's not really anti-Semitic, that it's only his emotional problems. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. I think that these thoughts were obviously in his mind, and perhaps his emotional illness loosened his tongue.
On December 30th, 1990, Strugnell was officially dismissed from his position as editor-in-chief, though not from the scroll team. It was an abrupt ending to a long career.
He has 30 years of distinguished scholarship and the most loyal band of students you can imagine. This is the man who has broken down.
Following Strugnell's downfall, the Israelis appointed new editors, promising publication by the year 2000. But in September 1991, the story took yet another twist. Two scholars from Hebrew Union College in Ohio secretly recreated the text of the scrolls on a home computer.
At the order of the Mevaker.
Frustrated by the lack of access, Ben Zion Wacholder and Martin Abegg worked from an index Strugnell had given them for their own research. The index listed each word and its location in the scrolls, and the computer pasted it all together. When published, their remarkably close reconstruction prompted the ultimate breakthrough.
This is NBC Nightly News.
Today, it was disclosed that the Huntington Library in California, which has photocopies of the scrolls, has decided to make them public.
Here were actual photographs of all the original fragments, which had been quietly stored for safekeeping far from the turmoil of the Middle East. In a bold move, the Huntington Library released them on microfilm to all scholars, without the scroll team's permission.
This is a very old Hebrew text. It has been given the name, no one's ever seen it before, of the Testament of Kohath.
Robert Eisenman was one of many who'd always been denied access.
Today, when we finally got in to see the microfilm reels of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it felt, because we've been waiting all these years, like a triumph, as if we finally basically kicked in the doors.
In just 2 weeks, the 40-year monopoly had crumbled. Now a new chapter of interpretation can begin, and the secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls may finally be revealed.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.